Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be having a little discussion and talking about whether or not it's possible to write an original story. If you write at all, you've probably heard or been told or thought to yourself that it's not possible to write an original story anymore. This is a very common take that floats around a lot. I see it all the time. I can't go a day without hearing someone say that, well, it's not really possible to write an original story anymore. Today I wanted to talk about whether or not that's true. This is a follow-up to our last video where I talked about the theory of 7 plot lines. This is often used as kind of an argument. You know, there are only 7 basic plot lines, so you can't write an original story anymore. I've been hearing this idea that you can't write an original story anymore for years, and I've never agreed with it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about whether or not that's true. Now, of course, this is going to be a very subjective video, mostly my opinion. There are a lot of different ways that you could approach this idea and make a case for whether or not it's possible to be original anymore or not. But I do think it's possible to be original, to spoil my thesis of this video right now. And I think this question, is it possible to write an original story, is often very ambiguous because really, how do we define what an original story is? Is an original story a story that doesn't have a single familiar trope? Is it a story that doesn't have a familiar structure? Can you combine familiar tropes in a new way and make it an original story? Or does the fact that there are familiar elements automatically make it unoriginal? Is a story unoriginal as soon as there's one other story out there with some kind of vague conceptual similarity? Is it more about concept or execution? Can you take a familiar concept or concept that's been done even just a couple times before and do it in a completely new way? Is that an original story? Or do you need an entirely original concept? What if you take an entirely original concept and use a very familiar structure? There are so many different ways to define what an original story is. From my perspective, there doesn't really seem to be any set criteria that makes a story original. I think it's almost something a little more intuitive. When we're reading and we feel like this is new and we've never encountered it before, it feels original, even if it does have familiar elements. Whereas a story could have some very new elements but be done in a very tired way and it wouldn't feel original at all. I feel like I've encountered a lot of very original stories, and I feel like I do so all the time. And although it may be true that maybe it is impossible to write something fully original in the sense that it doesn't have a single familiar element of story structure, because at a certain point, if you get broad enough, everything has been done before. Where are you going to draw the line? Are you going to say, well, we've seen a story about a person before? If you look at it from a very, very broad sense, sure, maybe it is impossible to write something original. But at that point, your criteria is so broad that it's basically meaningless. At a certain point, if you're using basic storytelling structure and theory to say that something's not original, that again, it's too broad. If a story follows 3-act structure, is it not original because we've seen 3-act structure before? 3-act structure is the kind of thing that is so familiar but yet so in the background that we're probably not going to notice it. And it's similar with tropes, you know, almost every story will have some sort of trope. There are so many tropes. Have you ever fallen into the endless void of TV tropes? Everything has a trope. There are things that I never even thought would have a name and be considered a trope. They're a trope. There seems to be a trope for everything. So if a story isn't original because it contains 1 or 2 tropes, again, a lot of tropes are defined so broadly that it's hard to not fall into them. A lot of the time, this argument that there are no original stories, interestingly comes with the caveat that there are no interesting stories anymore. With this idea that at some point there were original stories, but we've told every single existing story. Again, I think that this falls under this very broad view of storytelling where we can say, okay, so we've seen a story about a person who goes on a quest and then comes back and saves their homeland. That's so broad that sure, we've seen it before. But what we haven't seen are stories with new specificities. Once again, I'm going to bring this back to specificity, and that's going to kind of be the key to this video, I guess, and my point, is specificity. Originality is in specificity. It's not in the broad strokes. We can always say, well, we've seen a story that follows basic story structure before. I don't think that inherently makes a story unoriginal. I think if a story has new and interesting specificity, then it can be an original story. And that, I think, is endless. I think new, interesting specificity is infinite. The more specific you get, the more infinite it can be. You know, when we're looking at things in very broad strokes, sure, we can say that stories all share some kind of basic similarity, or most stories share some kind of basic similarity. If you zoom out far enough, almost every single story could be described as something happens to a character. That definition of character might be very different. You could literally have a story about a molecule. Something happens to a molecule. That could still be considered a story. But the more and more specific we get, the more and more it becomes about the details, the more and more infinite storytelling can become. I don't think in the lifespan of humankind on this earth we will run out of stories to tell. We will never run out of relevant stories to talk about based on what is currently happening in the world. So that's my take. I personally think it is fully possible to write an original story, and I actually don't think it's that rare. I think there are a lot of original stories. I would love to hear what the most original book that you have read lately is. I just read Bunny by Mona Awad, and it was so weird. And I would definitely say original. I think it's a great example of a book that takes some things we've seen before and makes it utterly weird, and it's very specific in a very original way. Or do you completely disagree with me and you don't think it's possible to write something original anymore? I would love to hear your reasoning. There are definitely a lot of ways to approach this. This is really just my opinion and the way I see it. So thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing videos every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.